Good morning. We're here for the Library of Congress, the Veterans History Project, to interview Mr. Baker. The date is January 3rd, and we are in Etna, Wyoming. Could you tell us your full name for the record, Mr. Baker?
Wayne Brawley Baker.
And your date of birth?
I was born August 15th, 1924.
And where were you born?
Afton, Wyoming.
And could you tell us the names of your parents?
My father's name was William Alonzo Baker. My mother was Blanche Brawley, of course Baker again.
Mm-hmm. All right. And did you have siblings? And what can you tell us about your siblings?
Yes, there were 8 in my family. Well, there were 9. Lost a sister shortly after birth, but living for many years were 8 of us. My oldest brother is Lloyd Baker, and he is 104 years old now. Carl has passed away. He would be the next in line, then Dennis, who has also passed away. And my sister, older sister, was Margie, then me, then Rex and Lester.
Mm-hmm.
And then my youngest sister is Elsie.
Did any of your siblings serve our country during the war or at any time?
Yes. Lloyd did not serve in the military, but he, during the war, he was teaching aeronautics to the flyers for the Army Air Corps. Carl served as a CB, and where he spent a big part of the war was in the Aleutians, building buildings for the bases up there. Dennis flew in B-17s, flew over Germany, over Europe, bombing, and then I flew 32 missions over Germany, over Europe in the B-24. My brother Lester, or Rex I should say, he was in the medical corps. Lester didn't get into the war into the military until after the war was over.
So your mother had a lot to pray about and worry about during the war, obviously. That's a lot of
no question.
Boys in the war.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Tell us, let's go to the point just prior to Pearl Harbor. Tell us where you were just prior to that, and then kind of walk us through the time you actually heard about Pearl Harbor.
Well, I left Star Valley on the 6th of December, took a bus and went to California. I had 2 brothers down there that were in the carpenter business, and they said there was plenty of work down there. And so I went down there to work with the intentions of coming back to Star Valley the next year to finish my schooling. And I went to work originally for Western Union, delivering telegrams throughout the East Bay area, Oakland, Alameda, Richmond, Berkeley, and all of that area. I worked there for a few months and then went to work in the shipyard. I worked at Pacific Bridge Shipbuilding Company in Alameda, We were building a 4,000-ton, very fast ship for the British. When I arrived in California on the 6th of December, the next morning, Dennis, my brother, and his wife and daughter decided to go down and ride bikes around the lake in Oakland. And we were riding around the lake. We passed a car that had a radio on, quite loud, and just as we passed it, we heard the announcement that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And so we stopped and listened to the radio there and found out what had happened. That's when I became aware of that Pearl Harbor had been bombed.
What was your immediate impressions? What were the emotions that surrounded hearing about such a thing at that time?
Very hostile toward the Japanese, and there were Japanese in the area. There were quite a few Japanese there in the area, and the people other than Japanese were showing quite a lot of hostility toward the Japanese people there. There was lots of hostility.
Okay. And at this point, you're how old when you first heard about it?
I would be 17.
Okay, so not quite old enough to enlist on your own. Take us from there. You were working at the shipyard at this time? Or were you still working?
Well, no, I just arrived in Oakland. I went to work for Western Union for a few months and then went into the shipyard. And in the shipyard, I was hired in as a ship fitter's helper. In other words, we fit the various sections of the ship together and tacked them together, and then the welders would come by and weld everything up that we had put together. In working with the ship fitter, quite often it was difficult to get a cutter when you wanted somebody to come and cut some steel for you, or to weld up something for you. So I started just to grab a hold of a torch and cut what I wanted cut, or spot something together. Didn't do major welding, but a lot of times you needed to weld a dog on to wedge something into position, and I could weld the dog on, and when I was through, I could cut it back off, and so I sort of did my own thing, and I liked cutting, and so finally they gave me a job that my primary job was cutting, using a acetylene torch to cut the steel to whatever shape I wanted, or whatever shape, not that I wanted, but whatever shape needed to be to fit the job.
Right. Now you said you innovated a cutting head. Tell us a little bit about the cutting head that you had modified.
Yes, I found that, logic told me that if you have a straight hole for the force of the oxygen to blow away the steel as it was heated, that if you counterboard that hole a ways, you could cause turbulence. In other words, it wouldn't be just a straight force of oxygen going out. It would be turbulent, and therefore you could sort of wash away the weld rather than just blow a hole through it. You could just sort of wash the weld away, and without cutting into the plates on both sides of the weld. And so after I developed that, then they give me all of the tough jobs of where where you had to remove the weld, there was a mistake or something, they had to remove the weld to move something. Why, I usually got the job. One time they had the chain locker in the wrong place, and it had to be moved. So I spent, I don't know, 2 or 3 days inside of a box about 7 or 8 foot square, cutting all the welds out of it to get it where you could move it. You weren't allowed to scar the plates where you removed the weld.
All right, so you got the tough jobs, but you had the special tool you developed as well. That's pretty interesting.
It seems like most of my life I've got the tough job.
Very good. So, okay, so let's keep going with this. You seem to be gaining skill as a welder and a cutter. What did they have you do next?
Well, during that time, there were a lot of men being drafted out of the shipyard and going into the military. If where they working in the shipyard, they couldn't just quit and join the Army or the Navy or Marine Corps or whatever. They were essential to the industry, and they had to stay there until they were drafted. When their draft number came up, then they were pulled out of that and went into the military. And the same thing happened to me. I was essential and couldn't quit and join the Army. I had to wait until I was drafted into the Army. And so we were training, I was training women to take over the jobs of cutting. And I found that they were very adaptable to that. They were very steady. They're more steady than most men. And I'd teach them how to light their torch and how to adjust the flame to get the most effective result, and how to clean their tips, and everything pertaining to cutting that I had learned over the past several months, or I don't know, maybe a year that I had worked at that job.
Were the women pretty happy to be there? What was their feeling about entering this different part of
I think they were quite happy. I think they were, a big percentage of them were wives of men that were in the military, and they were there to do what they could to support their husbands that were in the military. Yeah, they were. I think they were very upbeat.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So how long did you do that before you either changed jobs or got drafted? What came next?
Probably a year. I don't remember exactly, but in the neighborhood of a year.
All right. And then tell us about your entry into the service. You said you were drafted, correct?
I was drafted in. My number came up. You had to register for the draft, and when the draft board decided that your number was up, then you got a invitation from the United States government to join the service.
Now, did you have a choice of where you entered, or did they tell you what you'd be doing?
They gave you tests as I went into the service. I was given an aptitude test, I guess you call it, mechanical aptitude test, and through their testing, they determined what you were most adapted to. And of course, I was good at mechanics. I had a big part of my life was doing mechanical things, and so I was very adapted to mechanics, and so they put me in. I also had a letter from Rule Call, who was built the Call airplane in Afton, that I was very well acquainted with, and he gave me a letter of introduction to the Air Force, and I don't know whether that particularly helped or not, but they determined that I was going to be an aircraft mechanic. Mm-hmm. And so I went through basic training at Fresno, California, and then from there I went to, they sent me through small arms training in Salt Lake area.
Tell me a little, let's back up just a little bit. Tell me a little bit about basic training, your first basic training, your impressions of it. Tell us a little bit in detail about that.
Well, they taught you in basic training. You got a lot of exercise, a lot of running, a lot of push-up and exercises and so on. But the main thing, they taught you that when they said do something, you damn well better do it.
Now you said you were a bit rebellious. How did you do with that in the early days?
Oh, I don't think I had a problem. I was rebellious, but this was something that needed to be done, and I didn't rebel against that.
What happened to the guys that didn't quite get with the program?
It was kind of tough on them. They didn't get a lot of sleep. They did a lot of standing guard and doing. They were soon taught that it was a lot easier to obey than it was to fight the system.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Do you recall any of your instructors, perhaps, that brought you through training? Do you recall any of your instructors that brought you through the training? Anybody stand out in your mind?
No, not really.
All right. So basic training's at Fresno, and then your next stop was to go where, and what did you learn?
Well, I went to Salt Lake for small arms training, where we were taught to shoot the M1 rifle and Thompson submachine gun and handguns and revolvers.
Tell us about each one of those weapons as you recall it. Later on, we'll see your connection with firearms, but tell us your impressions of those arms when you were dealing with them.
Well, I was very good at shooting. When I was a kid, my dad used to challenge people to shoot against me. He liked to bet who could outshoot. Mm-hmm. So he sort of egged me into shooting targeting against competition, and I could do very well.
Yeah. What did you think of the M1, the Garand?
It's really very little different than what I hunted elk and deer with. So really, it was just a high-powered rifle, and I had done enough elk and deer hunting that I was good at it. Mm-hmm. And it was an exceptionally good weapon.
It was. Okay. Tell us a little bit about the other guns that you used.
Well, the Thompson submachine gun, the secret was to be able to hold it on the target. it was very prone to elevate as you fired, so you had to control your trigger finger that you put out 3 rounds, and instead of ending up shooting 6 before you get your finger off the trigger, because it was very rapid fire, and you had to learn to keep it on the target. Apply pressure down as you fired to keep it on the target. So it was a fun weapon.
How many rounds did the gun hold? And it was a full automatic.
It seems like it was 25. Yes, it was full automatic. You could select semi-automatic or full automatic, but semi-automatic, and it's just standard rifle, and you could hold it on the target very well. But when you put it on fully automatic, why, when you put out usually more than 3 rounds, you're completely off your target.
What? Tell us about the pistol. Which model pistol did they issue, and were you trained on?
Well, actually, it was a semi-automatic weapon. It was the model 1911 Browning model 1911. It was semi-automatic and not very accurate. It was not for target shooting, and it was a good weapon.
Yeah.
Very good.
Reliable weapon. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So your small arms training in Salt Lake, and then was there anything else they did there, or did they move you on at that point? What happens
from
next?
There, from there, I went into schooling. We were based at the Edgewater Hotel in Santa Monica, California, and each morning they would bus us out to an air base just east of where LAX is right now. I think Northrop. Northrop, the Northrop airline or manufacturing, aircraft manufacturing company was there. I think it was Northrop. Anyway, at that air base, we were taught mechanics, basic mechanics, and then disassembled an airplane engine and reassembled it, and learned to be able to repair an airframe. We were taught how to weld tubing together, gas weld tubing together, and of course I was good at that because I'd already learned the use of a acetylene torch, and so I didn't have any problem with that. You were taught how to put aluminum skin on a framework of an airplane, and also use fabrics, apply fabric to a frame of an airplane and dope it to make it to shrink it to fit the structure and increase the strength and durability of it. So you're taught the entire field of aircraft mechanics.
Was any of it aircraft specific? What did they train you on, or was it pretty much general aircraft mechanics?
The planes that we had to work on and the engines we had to work on were World War I airplanes.
Okay, so you were working on the techniques and the methodologies of handling aircraft.
We were learning the mechanics of repair of an airplane, not on current airplane. They were all World War I airplanes.
Did you enjoy that kind of work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
that's the kind well, that's what I would do if I wasn't working. That's the fun thing.
Yeah. Did anywhere along the way did you pick up a nickname, or what did they refer
No,
to you
sir.
as? No, always known as Wayne.
Oh, I've been called a lot of things, but
Nothing
not
stuck?
not that stuck.
Okay. All right. So you've got basic aeronautic mechanics fundamental training. Where did they send you next?
We went to a base and picked up a B-24, and then this became our plane, and our crew all joined together. And this is at Muroc Dry Lake. Muroc Airfield, I think, is what the name was. It's now Edwards Air Force Base.
So you were trained in mechanics of aircraft mechanics, but now you're assigned to a crew.
Now I'm assigned to a crew of 10 of us. There's the pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and bombardier. Those are the officers. Then there were 6 of us enlisted men. I was the engineer and top turret gunner. We had a tail gunner, 2 waist gunners, and a ball turret gunner. Well, that sometimes was optional, and we had a radio operator. So there were 6 of us enlisted men. I was the senior of the enlisted men, being the engineer.
Tell us a little bit about the B-24 in general, and then let's move to the more specifics of your job. But tell us about that plane. What'd you think of that plane?
Well, the B-24 has 4 engines. It's a twin tail, twin rudders on the tail. It's built like a big box car rather than classy looking. The B-17 is a much slimmer and more attractive airplane than the B-24, but the B-24 would carry a bigger load than the B-17. It had more powerful engines. It would go farther. It carried more fuel load, and so it was what, 15, 20 miles an hour faster airplane than the B-17. It wouldn't go as high as the B-17 because it didn't have all that extra wing area. It had just enough wing area to make it fly.
What was the typical cruising altitude or altitude that you would bomb from? Do you recall that?
Most of the time on a mission, you were at anywhere from 20 to 22,000 feet. The B-17 would fly higher than we would, but we would cruise at around 180 miles an hour, if I remember correctly.
Okay. Do you remember the approximate range of the plane? You remember the range that the plane would fly, distance, or hours?
Well, we'd fly without auxiliary fuel tanks. We would fly 8 to 9 hours,
All right.
and have enough reserve. I think 9 hours is about your maximum flight, and still have like a half-hour reserve.
What was the overall feeling about the plane? Was it reliable? Did you like the plane?
Well, sure. We were proud of the B-24. the B-17 operators, people that flew in B-17s, they were very proud of the B-17. My brother was always joshed me about they were up there above us, out of range for the guns, and we were down where we
You were in the thick of
within
it.
range
Yeah.
of them, and Dennis was always proud and needling me some on I was flying in the boxcar and they were flying in an airplane, things like this.
Mm-hmm.
But we were proud of what we.
How was the reliability on the plane?
The
Is it-
reliability.
Reliability, did it pretty much do its job with regularity?
The B-17 was a much safer airplane. It had a lot of extra wing area that wasn't really necessary. They claimed that you could shoot 10 feet off the wing, off the end of the wing of a B-17, and it still had no problem coming home. The B-24, it needed every bit that it had. You didn't get rid of it, and if you swing and it come home. The thing is, a B-17, there's a lot of B-17s still came home with most of their tail gone. But they had enough extra that they could still come home all right.
So you didn't have the margin of
B-24,
safety.
you didn't lose any of your tail on the B-24 and come home. It was all necessary.
Let's get to the specifics of your job on the plane. Outline for us what your job was on the plane.
Well, as the engineer, my responsibility on takeoff and landing was to sort of kneel down between the pilot. There was no seat there, just kneel down between the pilot and co-pilot and call out airspeed for takeoff. It was very critical. Your runway were very short. You didn't have any extra runway, so it was very critical that you lift off at the correct speed. So I'd call out airspeed to let them know what and it took both pilots flying it. It was very heavy on the controls, and so you had both pilots on the controls taking off and landing. And it was critical that they lifted off at the correct airspeed, depending on the load they had. If they were fully loaded, why you had to get a little higher speed before you lifted your nose off, before you started your takeoff from the runway. And so I'd call out airspeed, and then once they were in the air flying, then my job was to adjust the throttles to the correct setting, have all the throttles set for the engines to run at the correct speed, adjust the mixture controls to the proper settings, and synchronize the props to where you had both engines running at the same RPMs on each side of the airplane. Otherwise, you'd get a lot of vibration.
So was there an RPM gauge that you looked at?
Yes. Yeah. Well, you first set it according to the RPM. The tachometer gave you the basic, and then to synchronize the props, you looked across the propellers on the from one side to the other, and you've seen in films sometimes the wheels are going backwards in a car.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's you can do the same thing with the propeller. If you're looking across two propellers, one will be spinning, and the other one, well, it'll appear that that they are spinning, and if you adjust it to exactly the same RPM, then the shadow on those two propellers stops. It becomes just a blur, and they're not rotating. So you adjust your RPMs by looking across and watching the shadow in the propellers, and that's how you set your RPM final.
Started out with a little bit of science and then moved into the art of
Well,
balancing them, I
you
would
do it
assume.
with the gauge to start with, and that gets you close, and then you make the final adjustment by looking at the shadow in the propellers.
So everybody in that cockpit, the pilot, co-pilot, and yourself, were pretty busy when you were getting up to
Yes.
altitude.
Yeah, the pilot and co-pilot are busy. They're busy flying the airplane. I'm busy setting up the engines. I have control of the engines.
Now, when you took off, how many aircraft took off at once? Was there a formation? Well, how did that work?
Only one from our base. It was a single runway, and you lined up on the taxi strip, and each person or each airplane took its turn to take off. And sometimes in England, you'd create such a cloud by the propeller stirring up the air would actually form a cloud. And that cloud would have to settle so that you could see, the next airplane could see, the pilot could see where the runway was. And so the planes would take off as fast as they could, one behind the other. You didn't take off two on the runway at the same time, because the turbulence created from the previous airplane could give you problems of aerodynamics problems. So the air had to settle down a little bit before the next airplane took off, and they were usually about 1 minute apart. 1 minute after a plane left the runway, then the next one would pull onto the runway and take his turn.
Did your airplane have a name? Did you name the plane?
The planes that I flew mainly in, you weren't always in the airplane, the same airplane, were Ready and Willing and the Sweater Gal.
The Sweater Gal. Okay, and Ready. Okay, very good. All right, so so now part of your job you're taking care of adjusting those engines, but you also had a secondary job, another job, which was the gunner?
Once we were farmed up and ready to leave England, then my job was to get into the top turret and charge my guns with the ammunition and get ready to, in case you were attacked by fighters. And sometimes the Germans would try to catch the formation unprepared before, right as they were leaving England. So you had to be, by the time you left England, you had to have your guns charged and ready to fight.
What caliber gun was it?
Those were Browning 50 caliber,
And you're
fully automatic guns.
And you were in the top turret. What was the reference? It was called what? I believe the Martin gunner.
Yeah, well, the top turret was a Martin, built by Martin Company.
Mm-hmm.
So it was the Martin top turret.
Okay, so that's two-part job. You go up there. Were you cross-trained to do anything else? Did you have even if let's say somebody became incapacitated, was there another job that you had to be able to do?
No, my job was to take care of any mechanical problem with the airplane.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, so you're pretty much fully trained, and while you're being trained in the B-24 specifically, the crew is formed up. Was there additional training, or where'd you go next?
Well, we had phase training, which was once we joined as a crew. We flew mostly over Southern California and out into Nevada, learning to operate as a crew, each person learning what their responsibilities are to the crew, and the pilot and co-pilot learning to fly the airplane. Mm-hmm. They came out of training in a twin-engine small airplane, and then they had to learn to fly a four-engine airplane. So that's when they got their training to learn how to fly an airplane. It was gunners. Why sometimes we would be shooting at tow targets, learning to operate the turret. Of course, prior to that, I left out part of my training. We went to Las Vegas Airport, and at that base, we learned to fire the 50 caliber Browning machine gun, learned to disassemble it, to repair it, to clean it, and so on, and learned to shoot the 50 caliber at a traveling target that was traveling along a railway. Mm-hmm. And they'd have them traveling at a certain speed, and you'd have to be able to follow them and hit the target. Also, there we learned to shoot a shotgun at. You're riding in a pickup in an elevated seat in the back of a pickup, and they were shooting out clay targets in different directions, and you learn to lead them or reverse lead them or whatever, depending on the speed you were going and what direction the target was going. That's another thing I was very good at, because I had shot ducks and done a lot of duck hunting and goose hunting and so on. So I was pretty good with the shotgun.
At that phase, did anybody wash out? Were there guys that just couldn't hit anything, or how'd they?
Yes. There were people that just were not adapted to that mm-hmm. kind of thing. They couldn't.
Couldn't quite get the knack
They
of it,
just
huh?
couldn't adapt to that type
Yeah.
of gun work. That people from New York, like you are, that never shot a gun.
Yeah.
See,
Right.
it was easy for us from Wyoming, because that's what we lived.
You grew up doing it.
No.
Yeah. All right. So all right. Is that the extent of your training now? Are you pretty much ready to form up with a specific unit, or how did that?
Well, we spent, and I don't remember how many months, but we spent several months flying out of Muroc, flying out over the country. Sometimes we go out in Death Valley and we could brag about flying below sea level, and we'd get down 100 feet below sea level, and then we'd do high altitude flying, learn to use our oxygen. And another thing is we were taught, they spent a lot of time making sure you understood that at high altitude, if you didn't have oxygen, you could be dead in a matter of a few minutes and wouldn't know it. Huh. You don't realize when you're out of oxygen.
Describe the suits that you wore while you were flying. What was it? What were you wearing when you were up at that altitude?
Well, the pilot and co-pilot, they had seat packs. They set on their had a harness around them and set on the parachute. The rest of the crew had a harness that they buckled on that fit pretty close to them, and then you had two rings, and you had what we called a chest pack, and it's a bundle, probably 10 inches in diameter and about 16, 18 inches long, and that was your parachute. And if you had to bail out, you grab that chest pack and snap it onto the ears that are sticking out from your harness.
If you had to get out of the plane, how hard was it to get out of a plane if you had to evacuate the plane in midair?
Well, you had to go out through a hole that was probably 24 inches square.
Just one hole for the whole crew?
No, you had that was for the pilot, co-pilot, engineer, and radio operator would go out through that. The people in the waist and the tail gunner, ball turret gunner, if you had one, they'd go out through the wing, through the windows in the side of the airplane. Mm-hmm. That's where the guns were mounted for the waist gunners. Mm-hmm. They had a 50 caliber Browning 50 mounted on a tripod at each side, sticking out the waist windows, and that's where you'd go out if you were in the waist area. The tail gunner would have to come out of his turret and come up into the waist in order to get out.
Now, it was cold up there, right, when you were at altitude? The atmosphere in the plane?
Most generally, even in the summertime, you're down 50, 60, up to 70 below zero.
And so describe the clothing you wore to protect you from that cold.
Well, when I first went into combat, we wore mainly sheepskin. We'd have sheepskin boots that you wore over top of your shoes. We'd have sheepskin like a jumper suit, and a sheepskin jacket that went over top of that. Your hat was made of sheepskin. Later on, I think probably about my 10th mission, we were issued heated boots, which the big problem was freezing your feet. Mm-hmm. and your hands, of course. And they came out with a heated boot. It was a flannel with electric wires built into it, and you plug it into the electrical system of the airplane, and your boots were heated. Of course, every once in a while they'd short out, and then you'd get a burn out of it. But and then later on, I think toward the end of my missions, we even had a heated suit that we put on underneath our sheepskin.
So that was a lot more comfortable than
Yes,
in the beginning.
yes,
Yeah.
that made a big difference. When we finished our phase training, which lasted, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 months, I've forgotten what, then they shipped us up to a base in Northern California, up near Sacramento, and we picked up a brand new airplane, fresh from the factory. Only had a few hours flight from where it was built to that base. We took delivery of an airplane. I signed for the airplane, and it seemed like it was like $30,000. I, as the engineer, was responsible for signing for the airplane, and we left there and flew to Midland, Texas, and then from Midland to Miami Beach, then to an island off Cuba, and then to Fortaleza, Brazil. And at Fortaleza, we had developed a bad leak on our engine, on one of the engines, and so we spent 2 or 3 days there waiting for parts to come down from the States, and I and my assistant mechanic, we changed the gaskets on the engines and cured the leak, and then they put in auxiliary fuel tanks in the Bombay. Well, we called them Bombay tanks, and we flew from Fortaleza, Brazil, across to Dakar, Africa. And
Was it typical to have the engineer do the engine maintenance, or there was no maintenance crew there to handle it, or was that...
no, not at Fortaleza. We were responsible for doing our own repair.
Okay, so you're in Africa, and then
Now we flew over to Dakar, Africa, and just spent overnight there, and then went from there to Marrakech, Morocco. And at Marrakech, we were going to be there 2 or 3 days, and so they give us a pass to go into Marrakech, but we were warned about staying out of the old walled city. You're not allowed to go into the old walled city, and so we were Heil, the tail gunner, and I decided we'd go down and look around town, and they were selling a lot of knives and various things made of bronze and fancied up with various stone and so on, and we weren't interested in buying any, and we tried. There was somebody selling ice cream, so we tried an ice cream cone, and it was about the size of a small egg of ice cream, but we bit into it, and it It was warm. It was not ice cream by any means. I think it was frothed up goat milk or something like that. Horrible taste and stuff. And so we just gave it to the closest kid that we come to, let them have ice cream. So, and then the kid offered to take us around and show us the important, the interesting things of Marrakech. And so we hired him. Paid him some very small amount of money, and he led us around through buildings and so on. And the filth, the manure had built up in the towns. At a lot of the buildings that you went into, you had to almost get down on your knees to get into them. The streets had filled up with manure and stuff until you couldn't. There wasn't much left of the doorway. And anyway, he'd led us around through the various buildings, showing us various things, and we suddenly realized that there are no military people around, and we determined that we must be in a place that we shouldn't be. But going through these buildings, you didn't know that you went through a wall. And we were in the walled city, and about the time we realized that we were a place where we shouldn't be, a Jeep with some MPs showed up and picked us up. And of course the kid, as soon as he seen the military police coming, he disappeared real quick, because he knew he wasn't supposed to, we weren't supposed to be in there. And anyway, they picked us up and took us back to the base, to the provost marshal's office, and we were sitting there waiting to see the provost marshal, and because we were in the walled city that we weren't supposed to be in. And while we were there, one of the military police come in, and we were in the same room as the provost marshal, and we heard him telling him. He said, "We just picked up a bunch more of these natives with elephantitis and various incurable diseases." He said, "We've got a truckload of them now. What do you want us to do?" And he said, "Well, load them up and take them out far enough you know they're not going to get back." And in the conversation, he left, and I imagine that's what they did with them.
Yeah.
They had diseases, they just haul them out in the desert and leave them to die. Anyway, the provost marshal informed us that we were to be there the next day to decide what they were going to do with us for being in the walled city. And of course, the next morning, we left for England. So
your commander put you on that plane and
Yeah.
got you out of there. Do you remember the name of your commander, the pilot?
the pilot,
Yeah.
Bergetson.
Bergetson? Mm-hmm. Okay.
We were known as the Bergeson crew. In other words, the crew was always referred to as the pilot's name.
Where was he from? Do you recall?
He was from Wisconsin, I believe.
Okay.
I have all of that information too.
At this point, is there a designation for which Air Force and which bombardment group you were in? We haven't mentioned that specifically. Let's get that on the record.
Well, once we joined, you weren't designated for a crew. You were just 8th Air Force until you were after you got your briefing for evasion and what you were to do if you were forced down in enemy territory and all of this, which was given to us in North Ireland. Then it was determined what group, what wing, what group, what squadron, and everything that you were going to be a member of. And I'm not sure just when that was determined, but anyway, from North Ireland, we went by boat back to England, put on a train, and went to Norwich. At Norwich, we found out that then, at that point, we belonged to the 93rd Bomb Group, 2nd Air Division, and my crew particularly would be the 330th Squadron in the 93rd Bomb Group.
Okay. Let's step back to Ireland. Can you tell us a little bit about the kind of things they instructed you in the event you were shot down or parachuted onto enemy territory?
Well, we were told to what you could give, your name, rank, and serial number. That was virtually all that you could tell the enemy. And the instructor informed us that Russia was our enemy. Treat Russia the same as you would if you went down in Germany.
Interesting.
Destroy your bomb site. Don't destroy any instructions, important information. Treat Russia the same as if they were the enemy.
And the bomb site was called, is it at the Norden bomb site?
Yes, the Norton,
The Norden.
bomb site. We were given maps of France and Spain, and information as to the best way to get in contact with the underground in France, and cautions about the person that you might be talking to might not be what he indicates he is. In other words, be kind of cautious about who you surrender to and so on. And if you went down in Germany, surrender to the military. If you were picked up by hostile younger generation, shoot them. If you had the opportunity,
So
shoot
these would be like German nationals that were not military?
Yes, if they were not military, younger generation, be very aware of, because they were known to be more apt to kill American flyers. Older Germans, not so much worry about them. They would usually treat you fairly, take you into custody, and turn you over to the military. The younger generations was more likely to kill you, so don't hesitate to shoot them if they're showing hostility towards you.
So everybody on the crew carried a pistol?
Yes, we
As part of
carried
your-
a 45 automatic, 1911 model, 45 automatic.
Okay. All right, so that was the extent of that training. So you're coming back from the training at this point, and take us from there. Were you assigned your home base at this point, or?
Well, then we were rode the train down to Norwich and then went into the base. And usually the way it was handled with us is when we joined the squadron that we belonged to, then you had several test flights with the instructor to make sure that the pilot was capable of handling it okay, and it was sort of a test, a few days of testing to make sure that you were okay, that you that you were properly trained for the job.